I'd like to really sort of kick off by asking the two of you, how has Charlie Hebdo, the massacre that took place, how has it changed things? There was a very positive reaction amongst people after the massacre took place. And there was also some quite critical comments. And I'd be really interested to see how do you understand that event, and how has it changed the environment for free speech? I thought I'd start with Michael.
Yeah, it's still disastrous. I mean, it's horrible. I was, a couple of weeks ago, was the 10th anniversary of the publication of the Muhammad cartoons in Denmark, Jyllands-Posten, and the editor Flemming Rose, who published these. And what happened after that, I mean, the first session was interesting because we talk about the protections that we have in the United States codified into law in the First Amendment. It's important to remember that in the United States, nobody published the cartoons. There were two papers that did. The New York Sun, which was a short-lived conservative daily in New York, is now gone, and a Philadelphia paper, but they didn't publish the most controversial, which was Kurt Vestergaard's cartoon of Muhammad with the bomb and the turban. So, you know, from then to now, where are we? Well, on the 25th anniversary, the 10th anniversary, I was with Flemming Rose. Nobody had noticed that he was not in Denmark. He left and he gave a small speech at Wellesley College. I went up and met him. We had dinner that night, the night before. So that dinner was interesting because I had met Flemming before in Denmark, and he said, you know, this will sort of pass. It's a bad situation now, but people are rallying to the cause. 10 years later, I'm sitting in a very small restaurant in Massachusetts, and just over at the bar, these two incredibly hulking men with, you know, bald heads, kind of very conspicuous Danish guys that have been sent by the government. And they're looking around and making sure that, you know, no one's coming in and sneaking up behind him. So the next night, PBS, one of the actually few outlets that actually recognized that this was the 25th anniversary, did a sort of 9-10-minute package on the cartoons. That was pretty good. But there was a small problem. It was prefaced by Judy Woodruff, who said, we're not going to show the cartoons because, you know, and it's all this unbelievable nonsense. You know what they look like, and we don't want to, it's our policy not to offend anyone. I made a mistake one time when, after Charlie Hebdo, I guess it was the AP, somebody said, we're not going to carry the Charlie Hebdo cartoons on the wire because they offend people, and we don't want to offend people. God, that's not what journalism's about. It's about being nice. So I went to the AP Wire and started looking for stock photos. The first thing I looked for, comrades, as you well know, was Piss Christ by Andres Serrano. It was there. So, of course, I pointed this out, and the AP, God bless them, had the absolutely wrong response. They pulled Piss Christ. So because of me proving this point, you can no longer get an image of a crucifix dunked in a jar of urine on the Associated Press wire. So where we are now, well, nobody will show the cartoons. We have 12 people massacred in January. Remember that a week or a month later, and I went there a week after this, some half-literate psychopath tried to shoot up a free speech event on the anniversary of Salman Rushdie's The Fatwa on the Satanic Verses, 26 years later, in Denmark. They tried to kill Lars Vilks, who did a little cartoon of a dog with Muhammad's head on it. 2 people died that day. Because what ends up happening, this is by customary now in Europe, is you try to kill the cartoonist. They killed another guy there named Finn Nørgaard, who's a filmmaker. He was just visiting this free speech event. And then, as a sort of digestif, they go to a synagogue and just kill a random Jewish person, which they did, obviously, in Denmark, and which happened a few days later in Paris. So I hate to be so pessimistic, but I don't see any reason for optimism because nobody will show the damn things and everyone lies about it and says that we're trying to respect people. We are scared. And Jyllands-Posten said they would not publish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons after the shooting, which were comparatively mild. And I gave them an enormous amount of credit for this because the new culture editor, who's not Flemming Rose, gave an interview and said, no, we won't publish them. Why won't you publish them? Because we're scared. Are you kidding? We're not going to. I am responsible for all these people that work in this building. In the Jyllands-Posten building, they share a building with Politiken, which is the sort of left of center daily. They're in the same building, and so they all have to confab and say, no, we shouldn't do this. It's too dangerous. So I think, you know, how many months are we now after Charlie Hebdo? 10 months later, 10 years after Denmark. It's a we're in a terrible situation.
I'd like to ask the same question of you, Brendan. I mean, there was so much positive reaction in terms of people coming on the streets in Paris. All my friends changed their Facebook little thing to "Je suis Charlie." I mean, you know, wasn't that a positive outpouring of support?
I think it was positive. It was largely emotional rather than political. So it was revulsion at a massacre. That was a very palpable revulsion that people had been killed simply for expressing themselves. But it wasn't sustainable as a political reaction, I think. It reminded me of the kind of emotional outburst you often get after tragedies. So it wasn't a kind of clear-cut political demand to protect people who offend minorities. That was the problem with it. But in terms of what the Charlie Hebdo massacre changed, in my view, it crystallized things rather than changing things. Both the massacre itself and then the response to the massacre really crystallized trends that have been gathering pace for many years and decades, in fact. The massacre itself, in my view, those two killers, I think, should be seen as the armed wing of the offence-taking lobby. I don't see them as these completely foreign, crazy guys infected by Islamicism or, you know, infected by bin Laden or whatever else. I see them as quite European. They grew up in a country, on a continent, where there are laws that prevent you from expressing hateful or even stingingly critical points of view about minority groups, about faiths. They grew up in a country in which people have been arrested and fined for criticizing Islam, in which Brigitte Bardot has been fined 30,000 euros for saying that the way Muslims slaughter animals is barbaric, in which Charlie Hebdo itself had been taken to court for offending minority groups. So this idea that they were these kind of foreigners, that the battle of free speech is between us in the West and this kind of intolerant strain full of Eastern ideas is not accurate, I don't think. They were, to me, they were the armed wing of the, particularly of the Islamophobia industry. This industry we have in Europe which encourages Muslims to think of themselves as victims, to think of any criticism of their faith as obscene and unacceptable. And what you have on a daily basis in Europe is people attempting to shut down criticisms of Islam. And what we had in January this year was that taken to the next level. So I see it as being on a spectrum. And then the response to the massacre also crystallized trends that had been taking place. Because what we had initially, that quite positive, emotional, angry outburst across Europe, across the world, in fact. But then it was followed by a growing feeling of cowardice almost, or certainly of brushing Charlie Hebdo aside. And bit by bit, we saw literary figures, supposed liberals, commentators saying, well, maybe they were asking for it. Maybe if you criticize Islam too much, you can't really be surprised if someone shoots you in the head. That's effectively what people were saying. We saw that with American Pen when they had some of the authors for American Pen had that ridiculous hissy fit because, you know, shock horror, Pen wanted to give a Courage Award to a magazine whose staff had been massacred for what they say. You know, they were outraged that Pen would want to give a Courage Award to those people. It was insane. So, and that also, I think, spoke to this real fear of giving offence and this real abandonment of the ideal of freedom of expression among the very people who are supposed to protect it, in my view, which are literary figures, academics, liberals, commentators, that layer of society who you would expect to have some kind of deep attachment to freedom of speech, don't. So I think both the massacre itself was an expression of trends that have been growing in Europe for many years, and then the response, that kind of fizzling out of solidarity towards this kind of, well, you know, stop criticizing Muhammad and then you won't get killed. That was also, I think, an expression of a real worrying abandonment of the ideal of freedom among the very people who pose as liberals.
And a follow-up question on that. I think that as journalists, I think there is now a kind of self-censorship, which I think exists. So I think there's also a kind of chilling effect that the things have, that rather than having some outside body imposing on you that you shouldn't be publishing the cartoons or you shouldn't be offending people, there's a sort of self-imposed chilling effect, which I think has also become quite widespread. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all. Maybe start with Brendan.
Definitely. I think, see, my problem with the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo massacre is that there was a tendency to internationalize the crisis of freedom of speech. This is something that I had a real problem with. So it became, even among those who were making pretty good arguments about the problem of Islamist intolerance, the problem of people being shot for what they drew in their magazine, even the people who were making positive arguments about why that was a problem, had this tendency to internationalize it. So the idea was that, you know, Europe is relatively okay on these issues, but we have these newcomers who don't understand our values. Now, that might be true on various social issues. You know, I don't think Europe is particularly good at integrating its migrants. France is particularly bad at that. So there are social issues related to immigration and cultures and the clash of cultures and so on. But here, I think the tendency to internationalize it was wrong, because I saw this as a very European event. It made perfect sense in a really twisted, barbaric way. But then, and the thing you're talking about in terms of the self-censorship, that was really palpable afterwards. I mean, there were people who, like a newsreader in Britain, was interviewing someone who held up a copy of the magazine. It wasn't you, was it, Michael?
No, Caroline Forrest.
Right, held up and it was like, you know, she'd taken all her clothes off and done something really...
It was fantastic because the camera started going up.
Yeah.
And she was kind of, it was drowning in the shot, trying to get it.
It was really...
I mean, it was the instinct of the cameraman. I don't know if someone's talking into his earpiece, but they're lifting up the camera, and she's sitting in a studio.
It was a kind of madness, really.
Yeah.
And it was almost like something from the Middle Ages, like if people see this, they will die or something. But so it was really crazy. But then an issue I have now, which... I think Michael may disagree with me on this, but an issue I have now is I have a problem with the way in which publishing the cartoons has become the measurement of a person's commitment to freedom of speech. Yeah. Now, I completely agree that the reluctance to publish them speaks volumes about the screwed up era that we live in terms of freedom. But, you know, there's real pressure on Charlie Hebdo now to carry on caricaturing Muhammad, and it doesn't want to. And it partly doesn't want to because it's scared. But it partly does. One of their new editor said, everyone wants us to exercise the freedom of speech that they won't.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly right. I think too much pressure is being put on Charlie Hebdo to keep taking the mick out of Muhammad. And if it does that, everything will be fine. Yeah. But it won't be fine because Europe in particular is going down this very censorious road. And I think the Charlie Hebdo thing is one small part of it. So I'm not entirely convinced that publishing the cartoons is a great blow for freedom if it's not accompanied by a broader critique of the laws, the campus censorship, the fact that there are loads of things you can't say now, not simply drawing Muhammad, unless it's accompanied by that broader struggle against the new intolerance.
Yeah. Well, a few things. I mean, first on that, the camera not showing that on Sky News, it was the cover of the first issue of Charlie Hebdo after the massacre. And it's a hilariously sort of, you know, kind of British and American instinct to say we can't show that. Well, why can't you show it? Well, you know, depictions of the Prophet aren't allowed. Well, it's not, that's maybe in Islam, but I don't follow your blasphemy laws, number one. And number two, who said that the cover of Charlie Hebdo was Muhammad? There is no indication. It's just somebody in a turban with holding a sign that says, I am sorry. Just the idea that it might be close enough made that camera go up. They never declared that that was an image of Muhammad. That was a Muslim saying, I'm sorry for what these knuckle draggers are doing supposedly on my behalf. So that's what was being censored, by the way. The other thing that I found interesting about the whole debate amongst journalists, and I was sort of involved in the Penn thing, a little bit behind the scenes, talking to people at Penn, and I wrote a number of pieces about this, was the first thing that fascinated me was it didn't break down on political lines. Like, I mean, most of the people at Penn that were pushing this stuff and saying, you know, stand firm here, were people of the left. What I found that was different about it, it was older people of the left. Young people thought this was some sort of racial offense against, you know, because Islam, of course, is conflated with race. Whereas these older guys, I mean, because, you know, if you would have told me 20 years ago that it would have been the left that was submitting to religious intolerance and saying that, you know, well, we have to respect people's, I'd say you've lost your damn mind. And remember in 1989, after the fatwa, the people that really attacked Salman Rushdie were people on the right. And why was it people on the right? Well, it's two reasons. Because they thought maybe they'd be next if you could blaspheme against religion, number one. And number two, because Salman Rushdie wrote a book in 1985 called The Jaguar Smile. And I told this to his face. I don't like the book very much. But it was a book about Nicaragua and the Sandinistas. It was a sort of pro-Sandinista book. And they never forgave him for that. So if you look back, it was people like Norman Podhoretz that were attacking Salman Rushdie. Now, I mean, blink and you wake up, and it's people on the left who believe that because these two guys, and by the way, this is not people lurching towards an excuse for the two shooters at Charlie. These are people making explicit excuses, and I've written pieces that quote them chapter and verse, in which people say, you know, look, they grew up in this environment, and, you know, the war in Iraq, I literally had somebody make this, you know, in a public forum too. And I didn't understand this. So the war in Iraq, you disagree with this, which France wasn't involved in, by the way. And then you go shoot cartoonists. Where is the logic here? But we've internalized this sense of grievance, of this idea of that if we only treated these people better, and therefore we don't want to be honoring people that are offending Muslims. They're not offending Muslims. They were, you know, perfectly fine towards Muslims. They were offending an ideology, and that's what they attacked. And the problem I had in the US, specifically in the US, the UK is similar. You had people spilling barrels of ink on an issue that they didn't know anything about. I asked the guy that wrote for, you know, I'll say this is live stream, but I don't really give a shit, who wrote for the website that I write for myself. And I tweeted at him. And I said, have you ever seen Charlie Hebdo before last week? Have you ever heard of Charlie Hebdo? And he blocked me on Twitter. This is true. He never responded. Because it was clear that he'd never heard of Charlie Hebdo. My favorite bit of all of this was a woman in Texas who was one of the signatories of this idiotic pen letter that was, you know, barely literate and completely incoherent. You know, it was the anti-Maghreb sentiment in Charlie Hebdo. She tweeted her support of this. She signed a letter. And she referred to Charlie Hebdo as a person. Now, this is what we're dealing with. It's like when your mother thought Led Zeppelin was a guy, you know? Charlie Hebdo, we have to stand up on, you know, this guy, Charlie Hebdo, what a bastard he is. And so I realized that as Brendan said, the emotionalism of this argument was that people really were unfamiliar with the publication. They, first of all, didn't realize that there are lots and lots of articles in the magazine. It's not a cartoon magazine. They hadn't realized it had been firebombed in 2011, 2012. And, you know, among other things, they didn't realize that, and nobody knows this, by the way, and it was in French newspapers that day. Those people were sitting around an oval table having their editorial meeting, you know, as other journalists here know, this sort of tedious thing that you have every morning. And before they got to the business of the day, which was talking about the magazine, they were talking about an anti-racism conference that they were involved with in sponsoring. These guys are all members of the old French Communist Party, and they were being denounced in Slate magazine, a well-known magazine in the US, as not very different than a quote, and I'm quoting this, and I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, a white power mag. A white power mag. Because they did, you know, crude little drawings of Muhammad, because they, and by the way, there was a survey of 535 Charlie Hebdo covers from the day of the massacre before, and they found that 25 of them or something, maybe it was 55, dealt with the Catholic Church. 7 dealt with Islam. And most of them dealt with the National Front, which is a far-right party in France. So we have all of these people sitting down, pontificating, saying dead cartoonists are racist, their bodies are hardly cold, and they're being denounced as fascist and racist by a bunch of people who don't speak French and have never seen the damn magazine. And at this point, I just give up. It's like, what? It's all this sort of virtue signaling of that I'm on the side of good because I don't really like racism. Well, they didn't either. And now they're dead because that was the thing that they were protesting against, religious bigotry and racism.
I'm interested in opening this up. I'd love to hear more from our panelists, but I'd like to open this up to any questions or points that people may have. I want to do the same thing that Brendan did, just because we've got very little time, of taking some batches, if that's okay. So there's 2 guys there, and that would be, they're right in the middle. Get you to work again, Viv.
Thank you.
We'll take one and then the other.
Very, very eloquent defense of the First Amendment, and I agree with most of what you say, but I do have to correct one factual point that Mr. Moynihan made. He said no one...
It's always me, isn't it?
Yes, it is. No, you said no one would republish the Danish cartoons. The bi-monthly Free Inquiry did republish
yes, yes. I should have specified newspaper, yes. You're right.
Yes.
Yes.
And even though we have a modest subscription base, around 20,000,
yes.
Our effort was noticed because the magazines were pulled by Borders bookstore.
That's right, yes.
When Borders existed.
Yes.
So, anyway,
ultimate revenge. They go out of business and you're still around. That's right, that is true. And there were a few other people that were magazines. Daily Newspapers was only one.
That was Ron Lindsay, the executive director or president of whatever your name is, title is of, yeah. Led Zeppelin isn't a guy?
No, it's a woman.
I just want to follow up on Ron's story. This is subtle journalism. The next article, the next issue of Free Inquiry had, you know those lines that are around articles surrounding them? They took those out for that issue. In other words, they got back at Borders by removing the borders.
There's a lady just there, just there, yeah. Back, go back, yeah.
I wonder how, I'm thinking in terms of, about the distinction, how to sustain to make the distinction between state-regulated and otherwise regulated censorship or whatever threat to freedom of speech there is. In the context, for example, when or where publication of controversial contents becomes, in some cases, like a manifestation of a somewhat sensationalist response to the problematic and less a demonstration of freedom of speech as such, and when these two collide in a weird way. So I guess that's kind of a question that I would have.
Yeah, I'm going to take one more. I'm going to take one more, and then just right at the top up there, yeah.
There's a great deal of talk about on a more official level, but I'm wondering about the cultural side of this discussion as well. You see I see this quite a bit with interpersonal relationships, particularly in the classrooms, among faculty, just among people in general, a real difficulty in expressing themselves, a real sense of looking for all the right words to say. And this is particularly true of the way that the actual term political correctness appears everywhere. Even when it's not a matter of political correctness, it's usually about political expediency. But the term has become so ubiquitous that it's actually flattened out and lost its meaning. But just in general, there's a sense that on a grassroots level, people are finding it more and more difficult to have just one-on-one conversations without having to circle the drain 17 times, looking for all the proper words to be expedient.
Okay, so some thoughts there. I mean, do we as journalists have, you know, should we be moderate? Do we have, as your book says, a duty to offend? I'm interested in that idea.
I think journalists should be as scurrilous and dirt-digging and outrageous as they want. And so you can either have a nice, polite publication or you can have an outrageous one. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely down to the editorial team and the journalists. I think we should bear in mind, in the British context anyway, we wouldn't have freedom of speech or press freedom unless the press had been absolutely disgustingly outrageous. 300 years ago or so, we had a guy called John Wilkes who published these newspapers. By his own admission, they were mostly full of lies about, you know, kings having affairs with their maids and bishops doing bad things to their sisters and all this kind of stuff. Made stuff up precisely to goad the authorities. And he was arrested. There were the famous Wilkes riots demanding his release. And out of that, not only did you get press freedom, but we also got democracy. Democracy grows directly from John Wilkes offending the hell out of the British establishment. So the right to offend is central to progress. It's central to progress. No leap forward, I think, no social or technological leap forward has come about without someone offending against an orthodoxy of their age. So we've got to defend the right to be offensive, and that involves punching up and punching down. This ridiculous distinction that is made. Charlie Hebdo was punching down, therefore it was bad. That makes no sense to me. Again, it's entirely a matter of freedom. You choose who you want to offend and you go about offending them. I think in relation to the question of Muslims, when does publishing certain things become antagonistic or insightful or makes people so angry that they might take that kind of action? I think in terms of offending Muslims, the most offensive people are not Charlie Hebdo, but the Islamophiles, the sympathizers with the Charlie Hebdo's killers, because what they really say is that Muslims have a lesser form of autonomy than the rest of us. They can't really help themselves. If you look at some of the justifications that are put forward for why Muslims will have killed these cartoonists or why they blow themselves up on the London Underground, it's because, they're so angry about the Iraq War, or they're so angry about what France did in Algeria 50 or 60 years ago. They just have to express it. And it's really dehumanizing and suggesting that because they're Muslims, because they're isolated, because they're fragile, they can't help what they do. So the most offensive arguments come from those who seem to be defending Muslims. And I think we have to we have to allow journalists to be as offensive as they want. And we have to trust in all citizens, regardless of their cultural background, that they have the capacity to read and hear everything and to decide rationally whether they agree with it or not.
And a quick point on this is that it's a very important point. And you'll note, and they should be mentioned, because they often go unmentioned, the very, very brave Muslim liberals in a lot of societies, if it's Majid Nawaz in the UK, a guy named Nasser Khader in Denmark, and they make the same point. They do understand one thing. If you go up and you shoot somebody in a synagogue for no reason, you're going to have a newspaper the following day that has a bunch of recapitulations of Danish foreign policy. If, as a fascist, you go and kill a Muslim, no one's going to make those excuses for you, and they shouldn't. That's right, the other one's wrong. And liberal Muslims say, we don't want to be held to this sort of separate standard, that we can't stand these foreign policy arguments so much that we're driven insane and have to go, kill Jews. That's utter hogwash, and it's also really condescending. That's the first thing. Second thing is on the point about media. I agree with Brendan. The other thing is Americans love this stuff. I don't know if there's an exhibit that mentions it here at the museum, which is a fantastic museum. I haven't been in a while. But the most popular magazine in this country in the sort of 1950s was a magazine called Confidential. It sold 3 million plus copies every week. And it published whatever the hell it wanted. It outed Tab Hunter as gay in 1955. They were right, by the way. But, scurrilous, nasty stuff. People like this. Sort of the biggest news website in the world is the Daily Mail. It's not Die Zeit or something. I mean, we have to understand that people actually enjoy this stuff. And as far as, what happened, what do you do? Is there legal recourse? Last week, on the cover of one of Italy's biggest, most respected newspapers, La Repubblica, I was referred to as somebody who might be in the pay of the mafia. What do I do about that? Do I go to a lawyer, an Italian lawyer? Italian lawyer. It's like, I don't know. I said, you know what? Okay. If somebody reads that and then reads my stuff and thinks that this kind of pipe cleaner arm, gangly Moynihan from Boston is somehow in the pay of the mafia, then they have more problems than me. So, I mean, this idea, I think if given oxygen, these ideas are usually sort of beaten down in the public sphere. To the previous session, somebody brought up Rwanda, and this one comes up a lot. And there was a radio station during the Rwanda genocide in 1994 that referred to Tutsis as cockroaches. But it's the idea that these words on their own can create genocidal conditions. This is not true in Nazi Germany. And by the way, just to point out, in the 1920s in the Weimar Republic, there were very, very strict hate speech laws. Joseph Goebbels used to call the police chief of Berlin, this guy named Bernhard Weiss, I think it's Bernhard Weiss, but last name was Weiss, used to say the most horrible things about Weiss in his newspaper called Der Angriff. He was arrested. He was brought to court. He was fined. There were hate speech laws all through the 1920s in Germany, and then look what happened. It didn't prevent the Nazis from rising to power. This idea, and there's a lot of academic studies on this subject, that words create these situations, strikes me as nonsense. Can they have an effect? Absolutely, of course. And as Greg Lukianoff pointed out, we do have, the First Amendment doesn't cover this stuff. And it's always important to point out that the one thing that people bring up all the time, shouting fire in a crowded theater. Just before I end on this, because my friend and great hero, Christopher Hitchens, used to point this out all the time. That was one of the dumbest Supreme Court decisions of all time. The person that was shouting fire in a crowded theater was a Jewish socialist handing out anti-war literature in 1917 in Union Square. Handing out literature that said, this is an unbelievably stupid war, and it was. And he was shouting fire in a crowded theater. That's who the person was. It wasn't somebody literally in a theater saying, like, inciting people. It was somebody handing out literature that was their right and their free speech. And that's where that stupid chestnut comes from. Thank you, Hitch.
Anyway, I'd love to, I was ignoring this side of the room, so right at the back there, yeah.
And the last section, it sounds like there's an underlying argument that says cultures do not have the right to protect their own culture. Charlie Hebdo was such a huge issue because it occurred in Paris, where there is a culture of freedom of speech. If the same thing had happened in Riyadh or Mecca, it never would have made the papers. It wouldn't have been considered. But it's not only Islamic cultures that have this issue. Singapore has this huge culture against pornography. Japan, Korea, Thailand, they are all over. The issue is the ability of a culture to protect its culture. The underlying argument of the right to offend seems to say that a culture has no right, a society has no right to protect its culture. And I'd like to hear your responses to that.
Interesting question, yeah. This guy, yes. Yeah.
Actually, I think that question's more interesting, and you should probably skip mine, but since I'm here. I want to go back to something Michael said at the very beginning about the genuine fear that publishers and editors feel, and ask you, and Brendan, I guess, to say which is the more significant effect that is causing people to be reticent on certain topics, the physical fear or bad ideas, a failure to understand liberalism?
That's a good question as well. I'm going to take one last question, the lady here, and then this will be your last time to come back, guys. So
okay, yeah.
All your brilliant
Brief.
thoughts will come out. Yeah.
God help me, I'm originally from Alabama, and therefore I get a lot of Facebook posts from friends and relatives there. I worry about the fact that some just absolutely horrible, horrific things get posted, things that could incite things, and that these are not just individual insults like you were talking about or whatever, or things that you assume that a reasonable person wouldn't take this real seriously. This is the world in which these people live in. They don't get a lot of stuff from other sources, and they don't believe what they do get. In their mind, they're under attack, and all these horrible people are coming to get them, and all they can do is just kill them. Short of censorship, how do we take that kind of trend seriously? How do we deal with it?
I think actually that question is related to David Bose's question, because I often find that, to answer David's question, that there is a legitimate fear, a physical fear, a fear of violence. But the other fear that is related to this is the fear of uncomfortable allies. And I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal yesterday in which I quoted Ian McEwan, who gave a commencement speech after the Charlie Hebdo massacre. And he said, don't fall victim to this thing that happened so much in the Cold War, which was the idea that we didn't, as liberals, want to face up to the evil of the Soviet Union because we didn't want to be standing next to Bill Buckley and Brent Bozell. And that's not this is what I find often is the fear of being on the wrong side or having the wrong allies. And to be very clear, some of the allies that do sidle up next to you are pretty horrible people. I mean, I've had some that I don't want to agree with them, and I don't want them agreeing with me, but they do. But to the point of the kind of sewer that is Facebook, and it allows a great kind of insight into how other people think. I actually have a pretty kind of jingoistic response to this. I'm not usually jingoistic, but since 9/11, America responded with the amount of Islamophobia that I would expect, right? There hasn't been a huge wave in this country of physical violence. Has it happened? Absolutely. And every example of that is hideous. And to show you how stupid Americans are about religions other than sort of Christian religions, is that after 9/11, somebody was murdered in Arizona. He owned a gas station, and he was shot. He was a Sikh. Yeah, that's how good we are at this sort of thing. So, I mean, what has happened as a response? Not much. Is there a wave of this stuff? I don't believe that there is. I haven't come in contact with it. Do people believe crackpot stuff? Yes, and unfortunately, that's the price of free speech and of democracy. And I try to back away from that because it comes close to the sort of Marxist concept of false consciousness. That they have all these, if only they didn't have Fox News, they would think the right thing. And I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's true. But I think that came up in a place where people wanted that kind of information. So it doesn't worry me maybe as much as it should. Maybe it should.
Brendan.
I think in relation to a society protecting its culture, the problem in France, which, as is often the case, problems in France speak to problems across the civilized world. France has lost the plot on freedom in particular. It's completely and utterly lost the plot. What few people talk about is that the French government pumped money into Charlie Hebdo after the massacre. They've erected a monument to them. There are all these beautiful monuments across Paris, Charlie, Liberty, Equality, all these kind of graffiti. There was a very pro-Charlie sentiment, but the French government doesn't give a damn about freedom of speech, as reflected in the fact that after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, people were arrested for praising the killers of Charlie Hebdo. A boy was questioned by the police because he did a mock-up of a Charlie Hebdo cover in which it wasn't Muhammad being shot, but it was the Charlie Hebdo cartoonist being shot. So you had a situation where people were being arrested by the police for mocking Charlie Hebdo, which is too much irony to be able to handle. And what you have is, I think, the French Republic is so weak, it feels so detached from its core values, its Enlightenment values, that it tries to assert them in a really cack-handed way. So it bans the burqa, which is just profoundly illiberal. Or this week, it said that Muslim and Jewish children, if they don't eat the pork they are served at school, they won't get school dinners. I mean, that's just nasty. Yeah. And so you have this attempt by the French Republic to assert its values in a quite mean-spirited way because it doesn't believe in them anymore in a profound way. Yeah. And I think that really came to light after Charlie Hebdo in relation to the solidarity with it. Finally, the final point I wanted to make was, who are people scared of? Are they really scared of being shot in the head by an Islamist, which is a really, really, really rare occurrence in Europe? Or are they scared of something else? I think we have a tendency, liberals in Europe in particular, have a tendency to externalize their own cowardice and project it onto these kind of often quite mythical mobs of Muslims. Now, no doubt there are intolerant Islamist groups. We've seen them, in Europe. But we externalize our own desire to self-censor and we blame them. So, for example, in Britain, plays have had scenes cut out of them which might be offensive to Muslims. Books have not been published because they might be offensive to Muslims. There weren't any mobs in these cases. There weren't any threats. It was a preemptive self-censorship. Yeah. And what it really spoke to was intellectual cowardice, a reluctance to offend, a reluctance among the literary establishment to say what they think or to express any view they feel is legitimate. But instead of saying, we're cowards, so we're not going to do this, they say, those people over there might get angry. So there's too much externalization going on. I think the problem post-Charlie has been that there is too much focus on the threat posed by foreign-influenced individuals and groups, and not enough discussion of the fact that Europe across the board, in relation to law, politics, and the academy, has abandoned freedom of speech in a really profound way. And we need to build that up rather than running scared of a bunch of crazy Islamists.
Thank you both very much. It's very interesting.
Thank you.